Mr. Watson, Come Here, The Birth of the Telephone and Its Future, circa 1910. Written by Herbert N. Casson. Narrated by Brian Daniels. The Birth of the Telephone. In that somewhat distant year, 1875, when the telegraph and the Atlantic cable were the most wonderful things in the world, a tall, young professor of elocution was desperately busy in a noisy machine shop that stood in one of the narrow streets of Boston, not far from Scollay Square. It was a very hot afternoon in June, but the young professor had forgotten the heat and the grime of the workshop. He was wholly absorbed in the making of a nondescript machine, a sort of crude harmonica with a clock spring reed, a magnet, and a wire. It was a most absurd toy in appearance. It was unlike any other thing that had ever been made in any country. The young professor had been toiling over it for 3 years, and it had constantly baffled him until, on this hot afternoon in June 1875, he heard an almost inaudible sound, a faint twang, come from the machine itself. For an instant, he was stunned. He had been expecting just such a sound for several months, but it came so suddenly as to give him the sensation of surprise. His eyes blazed with delight, and he sprang in a passion of eagerness to an adjoining room in which stood a young mechanic who was assisting him. "Snap that reed again, Watson!" cried the apparently irrational young professor. There was one of the odd-looking machines in each room, so it appears, and the two were connected by an electric wire. Watson had snapped the reed on one of the machines, and the professor had heard from the other machine exactly the same sound. It was no more than the gentle twang of a clock spring, but it was the first time in the history of the world that a complete sound had been carried along a wire, reproduced perfectly at the other end, and heard by an expert in acoustics. That twang of the clock spring was the first tiny cry of the newborn telephone, uttered in the clanging din of a machine shop and happily heard by a man whose ear had been trained to recognize the strange voice of the little newcomer. There, amidst flying belts and jarring wheels, the baby telephone was born, as feeble and helpless as any other baby, and with no language but a cry. The professor-inventor who had thus rescued the tiny foundling of science was a young Scottish-American. His name, now known as widely as the telephone itself, was Alexander Graham Bell. He was a teacher of acoustics and a student of electricity, possibly the only man in his generation who was able to focus a knowledge of both subjects upon the problem of the telephone. To other men, that exceedingly faint sound would have been as inaudible as silence itself, but to Bell, it was a thunderclap. It was a dream come true. It was an impossible thing, which had in a flash become so easy that he could scarcely believe it. Here, without the use of a battery, with no more electric current than that made by a couple of magnets, all the waves of a sound had been carried along a wire and changed back to sound at the farther end. It was absurd. It was incredible. It was something which neither wire nor electricity had been known to do before. But it was true. No discovery has ever been less accidental. It was the last link of a long chain of discoveries. It was the result of a persistent and deliberate search. Already for half a year or longer, Bell had known the correct theory of the telephone, but he had not realized that the feeble undulatory current generated by a magnet was strong enough for the transmission of speech. He had been taught to undervalue the incredible efficiency of electricity. Not only was Bell himself a teacher of the laws of speech, so highly skilled that he was an instructor in Boston University. His father also, his two brothers, his uncle, and his grandfather had taught the laws of speech in the universities of Edinburgh, Dublin, and London. For 3 generations, the Bells had been professors of the science of talking. They had even helped to create that science by several inventions. The first of them, Alexander Bell, had invented a system for the correction of stammering and similar defects of speech. The second, Alexander Melville Bell, was the dean of British elocutionists, a man of creative brain and a most impressive facility of rhetoric. He was the author of a dozen textbooks on the art of speaking correctly, and also of a most ingenious sign language which he called visible speech. Every letter in the alphabet of this language represented a certain action of the lips and tongue, so that a new method was provided for those who wished to learn foreign languages or to speak their own language more correctly. And the third of these speech-improving bells, the inventor of the telephone, inherited the peculiar genius of his fathers, both inventive and rhetorical, to such a degree that as a boy he had constructed an artificial skull from gutta percha and India rubber, which, when enlivened by a blast of air from a hand bellows, would actually pronounce several words in an almost human manner. The third bell, the only one of this remarkable family who concerns us at this time, was a young man, barely 28, at the time when his ear caught the first cry of the telephone. He had been educated in Edinburgh, the city of his birth, and in London, and in one way and another picked up a smattering of anatomy, music, electricity, and telegraphy. Until he was 16 years of age, he had read nothing but novels and poetry and romantic tales of Scottish heroes. Then he left home to become a teacher of elocution in various British schools, and by the time he was of age, he had made several slight discoveries as to the nature of vowel sounds. Shortly afterwards, he met in London two distinguished men, Alexander J. Ellis and Sir Charles Wheatstone, who did far more than they ever knew to forward Bell in the direction of the telephone. Ellis was the president of the London Philological Society. Also, he was the translator of the famous book on The Sensations of Tone, written by Helmholtz, who, in the period from 1871 to 1894, made Berlin the world center for the study of the physical sciences. So it happened that when Bell ran into Ellis as a young enthusiast and told his experiments, Ellis informed him that Helmholtz had done the same things several years before and done them more completely. He brought Bell to his house and showed him what Helmholtz had done, how he had kept tuning forks in vibration by the power of electromagnets and blended the tones of several tuning forks together to produce the complex quality of the human voice. Now, Helmholtz had not been trying to invent a telephone nor any sort of message carrier. His aim was to point out the physical basis of music and nothing more. But this fact that an electromagnet would set a tuning fork humming was new to Bell and very attractive. It appealed at once to him as a student of speech. If a tuning fork could be made to sing by a magnet or an electrified wire, why would it not be possible to make a musical telegraph, a telegraph with a piano keyboard, so that many messages could be sent at once over a single wire? Unknown to Bell, there were several dozen inventors then at work upon this problem, which proved in the end to be very elusive. But it gave him at least a starting point, and he forthwith commenced his quest of the telephone. As he was then in England, his first step was naturally to visit Sir Charles Wheatstone, the best-known English expert on telegraphy. Sir Charles had earned his title by many inventions. He was a simple-natured scientist and treated Bell with the utmost kindness. He showed him an ingenious talking machine that had been made by Baron de Campalin. At this time, Bell was 22 and unknown. Wheatstone was 67 and famous. And the personality of the veteran scientist made so vivid a picture upon the mind of the impressionable young Bell that the grand passion of science became henceforth the master motif of his life. From this summit of glorious ambition, he was thrown, several months later, into the depths of grief and despondency. The White Plague had come to the home in Edinburgh and taken away his two brothers. More, it had put its mark upon the young inventor himself. Nothing but a change of climate, said his doctor, would put him out of danger. And so, to save his life, he and his father and mother set sail from Glasgow and came to the small Canadian town of Brantford, where for a year he fought down his tendency to consumption and satisfied his nervous energy by teaching visible speech to a tribe of Mohawk Indians. By this time it had become evident, both to his parents and to his friends, that the young Graham was destined to become some sort of a creative genius. He was tall and supple, with a pale complexion, large nose, full lips, jet black eyes, and jet black hair, brushed high and unusually rumpled into a curly tangle. In temperament, he was a true scientific bohemian, with the ideals of a savant and the disposition of an artist. He was wholly a man of enthusiasms, more devoted to ideas than to people, and less likely to master his own thoughts than to be mastered by them. He had no shrewdness, in any commercial sense, and very little knowledge of the small practical details of ordinary living. He was always intense, always absorbed. When he applied his mind to a problem, it became at once an enthralling arena in which there went whirling a chariot race of ideas and inventive fancies. He had been fascinated from boyhood by his father's system of visible speech. He knew it so well that he once astonished a professor of Oriental languages by repeating correctly a sentence of Sanskrit that had been written in visible speech characters. While he was living in London, his most absorbing enthusiasm was the instruction of a class of deaf mutes, who could be trained to talk, he believed, by the means of the visible speech alphabet. He was so deeply impressed by the progress made by these pupils and by the pathos of their dumbness that when he arrived in Canada he was in doubt as to which of these two tasks was the more important, the teaching of deaf mutes or the invention of a musical telegraph. At this point, and before Bell had begun to experiment with his telegraph, the scene of the story shifts from Canada to Massachusetts. It appears that his father, while lecturing in Boston, had mentioned Graham's exploits with a class of deaf mutes. And soon afterward, the Boston Board of Education wrote to Graham, offering him $500 if he would come to Boston and introduce his system of teaching in a school for deaf mutes that had been opened recently. The young man joyfully agreed, and on the 1st of April 1871, crossed the line and became for the remainder of his life an American. For the next 2 years, his telegraphic work was laid aside, if not forgotten. His success as a teacher of deaf mutes was sudden and overwhelming. It was the educational sensation of 1871. It won him a professorship in Boston University and brought so many pupils around him that he ventured to open an ambitious School of Vocal Physiology, which became at once a profitable enterprise. For a time, there seemed to be little hope of his escaping from the burden of this success and becoming an inventor when, by a most happy coincidence, 2 of his pupils brought to him exactly the sort of stimulation and practical help that he needed and had not up to this time received. One of these pupils was a little deaf-mute tot, 5 years of age, named Georgie Sanders. Bell had agreed to give him a series of private lessons for $350 a year, and as the child lived with his grandmother in the city of Salem, 16 miles from Boston, it was agreed that Bell should make his home with the Sanders family. Here he not only found the keenest interest and sympathy in his air castles of invention, but also was given permission to use the cellar of the house as his workshop. For the next 3 years, this cellar was his favorite retreat. He littered it with tuning forks, magnets, batteries, coils of wire, tin trumpets, and cigar boxes. No one outside of the Sanders family was allowed to enter it, as Bell was nervously afraid of having his ideas stolen. He would even go to 5 or 6 stores to buy his supplies, for fear that his intentions would be discovered. Almost with the secrecy of a conspirator, he worked alone in this cellar, usually at night, and quite oblivious of the fact that sleep was a necessity to him and to the Sanders family. "Often in the middle of the night, Bell would wake me up," said Thomas Sanders, the father of Georgie. "His black eyes would be blazing with excitement. Leaving me to go down to the cellar, he would rush wildly to the barn and begin to send me signals along his experimental wires. If I noticed any improvement in his machine, he would be delighted. He would leap and whirl around in one of his war dances and then go contentedly to bed. But if the experiment was a failure, he would go back to his workbench and try some different plan." The second pupil who became a factor, a very considerable factor, in Bell's career was a 15-year-old girl named Mabel Hubbard, who had lost her hearing and consequently her speech through an attack of scarlet fever when a baby. She was a gentle and lovable girl, and Bell, in his ardent and headlong way, lost his heart to her completely, and 4 years later he had the happiness of making her his wife. Mabel Hubbard did much to encourage Bell. She followed each step of his progress with the keenest interest. She wrote his letters and copied his patents. She cheered him on when he felt himself beaten. And through her sympathy with Bell and his ambitions, she led her father, a widely known Boston lawyer named Gardner G. Hubbard, to become Bell's chief spokesman and defender, a true apostle of the telephone. Hubbard first became aware of Bell's inventive efforts one evening when Bell was visiting at his home in Cambridge. Bell was illustrating some of the mysteries of acoustics by the aid of a piano. "Do you know," he said to Hubbard, "that if I sing the note G close to the strings of the piano, that the G string will answer me?" "Well, what then?" asked Hubbard. "Is a matter of tremendous importance," replied Bell. "It is an evidence that we may someday have a musical telegraph, which will send as many messages simultaneously over one wire as there are notes on that piano." Later, Bell ventured to confide to Hubbard his wild dream of sending speech over an electric wire, but Hubbard laughed him to scorn. "Now you are talking nonsense," he said. "Such a thing never could be more than a scientific toy. You had better throw that idea out of your head and go ahead with your musical telegraph, which, if it is successful, will make you a millionaire." But the longer Bell toiled at his musical telegraph, the more he dreamed of replacing the telegraph and its cumbrous sign language by a new machine that would carry not dots and dashes, but the human voice. "If I can make the deaf-mute talk," he said, "I can make iron talk." For months he wavered between the two ideas. He had no more than the most hazy conception of what this voice-carrying machine would be like. At first he conceived of having a harp at one end of the wire and a speaking trumpet at the other, so that the tones of the voice could be reproduced by the strings of the harp. Then, in the early summer of 1874, while he was puzzling over this harp apparatus, the dim outline of a new path suddenly glinted in front of him. He had not been forgetful of visible speech all this while, but had been making experiments with two remarkable machines, the phonautograph and the manometric capsule, by means of which the vibrations of sound were made plainly visible. If these could be improved, he thought, then the deaf might be taught to speak by sight, by learning an alphabet of vibrations. He mentioned these experiments to a Boston friend, Dr. Clarence J. Blake, and he, being a surgeon and an aurist, naturally said, "Why don't you use a real ear?" Such an idea never had, and probably never could have, occurred to Bell, but he accepted it with eagerness. Dr. Blake cut an ear from a dead man's head, together with the eardrum and the associated bones. Bell took this fragment of a skull and arranged it so that a straw touched the eardrum at one end and a piece of moving smoked glass at the other. Thus, when Bell spoke loudly into the ear, the vibrations of the drum made tiny markings upon the glass. It was one of the most extraordinary incidents in the whole history of the telephone. To an uninitiated onlooker, nothing could have been more ghastly or absurd. How could anyone have interpreted the gruesome joy of this young professor with the pale face and the black eyes, who stood earnestly singing, whispering, and shouting into a dead man's ear? What sort of a wizard must he be, or ghoul, or madman? And in Salem, too, the home of the witchcraft superstition. Certainly, it would not have gone well with Bell had he lived 2 centuries earlier and had been caught at such black magic. What had this dead man's ear to do with the invention of the telephone? Much. Bell noticed how small and thin was the eardrum, and yet how effectively it could send thrills and vibrations through heavy bones. If this tiny disc can vibrate a bone, he thought, then an iron disc might vibrate an iron rod, or at least an iron wire. In a flash, the conception of a membrane telephone was pictured in his mind. He saw in imagination 2 iron discs, or eardrums, far apart and connected by an electrified wire, catching the vibrations of sound at one end and reproducing them at the other. At last, he was on the right path and had a theoretical knowledge of what a speaking telephone ought to be. What remained to be done was to construct such a machine and find out how the electric current could best be brought into harness. Then, as though fortune suddenly felt that he was winning this stupendous success too easily, Bell was flung back by an avalanche of troubles. Sanders and Hubbard, who had been paying the cost of his experiments, abruptly announced that they would pay no more unless he confined his attention to the musical telegraph and stop wasting his time on ear toys that could never be of any financial value. What these 2 men asked could scarcely be denied, as one of them was his best-paying patron and the other was the father of the girl whom he hoped to marry. "If you wish my daughter," said Hubbard, "you must abandon your foolish telephone." Bell's school of vocal physiology, too, from which he had hoped so much, had come to an inglorious end. He had been too much absorbed in his experiments to sustain it. His professorship had been given up, and he had no pupils except Georgie Sanders and Mabel Hubbard. He was poor, much poorer than his associates knew, and his mind was torn and distracted by the contrary calls of science, poverty, business, and affection. Pouring out his sorrows in a letter to his mother, he said, "I am now beginning to realize the cares and anxieties of being an inventor. I have had to put off all pupils and classes, for flesh and blood could not stand much longer such a strain as I have had upon me." While stumbling through this slough of despond, he was called to Washington by his patent lawyer. Not having enough money to pay the cost of such a journey, he borrowed the price of a return ticket from Sanders and arranged to stay with a friend in Washington to save a hotel bill that he could not afford. At that time, Professor Joseph Henry, who knew more of the theory of electrical science than any other American, was the grand old man of Washington, and poor Bell, in his doubt and desperation, resolved to run to him for advice. Then came a meeting which deserves to be historic. For an entire afternoon, the two men worked together over the apparatus that Bell had brought from Boston, just as Henry had worked over the telegraph before Bell was born. Henry was now a veteran of 78, with only 3 years remaining to his credit in the bank of time, while Bell was 28. There was a long half-century between them, but the youth had discovered a new fact that the sage, in all his wisdom, had never known. "You are in possession of the germ of a great invention," said Henry. "I would advise you to work at it until you have made it complete." "But," replied Bell, "I've not got the electrical knowledge that is necessary." "Get it," responded the aged scientist. "I cannot tell you how much these 2 words have encouraged me," said Bell afterwards in describing this interview to his parents. "I live too much in an atmosphere of discouragement for scientific pursuits, and such a chimerical idea as telegraphing vocal sounds would indeed seem to most minds scarcely feasible enough to spend time in working over." By this time, Bell had moved his workshop from the cellar in Salem to 109 Court Street, Boston, where he had rented a room from Charles Williams, a manufacturer of electrical supplies. Thomas A. Watson was his assistant, and both Bell and Watson lived nearby in 2 cheap little bedrooms. The rent of the workshop and bedrooms, and Watson's wages of $9 a week, were being paid by Sanders and Hubbard. Consequently, when Bell returned from Washington, he was compelled by his agreement to devote himself mainly to the musical telegraph, although his heart was now with the telephone. For exactly 3 months after his interview with Professor Henry, he continued to plod ahead along both lines until, on that memorable hot afternoon in June 1875, the full twang of the clock spring came over the wire, and the telephone was born. From this moment, Bell was a man of one purpose. He won over Sanders and Hubbard. He converted Watson into an enthusiast. He forgot his musical telegraph, his visible speech, his classes, his poverty. He threw aside a profession in which he was already locally famous. And he grappled with this new mystery of electricity, as Henry had advised him to do, encouraging himself with the fact that Morse, who was only a painter, had mastered his electrical difficulties, and there was no reason why a professor of acoustics should not do as much. The telephone was now in existence, but it was the youngest and feeblest thing in the nation. It had not yet spoken a word. It had to be taught, developed, and made fit for the service of the irritable business world. All manner of discs had to be tried, some smaller and thinner than a dime, and others of steel boiler plate as heavy as the shield of Achilles. In all the books of electrical science, there was nothing to help Bell and Watson in this journey they were making through an unknown country. They were as chartless as Columbus was in 1492. Neither they nor anyone else had acquired any experience in the rearing of a young telephone. No one knew what to do next. There was nothing to know. For 40 weeks, long, exasperating weeks, The telephone could do no more than gasp and make strange, inarticulate noises. Its educators had not learned how to manage it. Then, on March 10th, 1876, it talked. It said distinctly, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Watson, who was at the lower end of the wire in the basement, dropped the receiver and rushed with wild joy up 3 flights of stairs to tell the glad tidings to Bell. "I can hear you," he shouted. "I can hear words." It was not easy, of course, for the weak young telephone to make itself heard in that noisy workshop. No one, not even Bell and Watson, was familiar with its odd little voice. Usually Watson, who had a remarkably keen sense of hearing, did the listening, and Bell, who was a professional elocutionist, did the talking. And day by day, the tone of the baby instrument grew clearer, a new note in the orchestra of civilization. On his 29th birthday, Bell received his patent, number 174,465, the most valuable single patent ever issued in any country. He had created something so entirely new that there was no name for it in any of the world's languages. In describing it to the officials of the patent office, he was obliged to call it an improvement in telegraphy, when in truth it was nothing of the kind. It was as different from the telegraph as the eloquence of a great orator is from the sign language of a deaf mute. Other inventors had worked from the standpoint of the telegraph, and they never did and never could get any better results than signs and symbols. But Bell worked from the standpoint of the human voice. He cross-fertilized the two sciences of acoustic and electricity. His study of visible speech had trained his mind so that he could mentally see the shape of a word as he spoke it. He knew what a spoken word was and how it acted upon the air or the ether that carried its vibrations from the lips to the ear. He was a third-generation specialist in the nature of speech, and he knew that for the transmission of spoken words, there must be a pulsatory action of the electric current, which is the exact equivalent of the aerial impulses. Bell knew just enough about electricity and not too much. He did not know the possible from the impossible. "Had I known more about electricity and less about sound," he said, "I would never have invented the telephone." What he had done was so amazing, so foolhardy, that no trained electrician could have thought of it. It was the very hardihood of invention, and yet it was not in any sense a chance discovery. It was the natural output of a mind that had been led to assemble just the right materials for such a product. As though the very stars in their courses were working for this young wizard with the talking wire, the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia opened its doors exactly 2 months after the telephone had learned to talk. Here was a superb opportunity to let the wide world know what had been done, and fortunately Hubbard was one of the Centennial commissioners. By his influence, a small table was placed in the Department of Education in a narrow space between a stairway and a wall, and on this table was deposited the first of the telephones. Bell had no intention of going to the Centennial himself. He was too poor. Sanders and Hubbard had never done more than pay his room rent and the expense of his experiments. For his 3 or 4 years of inventing, he had received nothing as yet, nothing but his patent. In order to live, he had been compelled to reorganize his classes in visible speech and to pick up the raveled ends of his neglected profession. But one Friday afternoon, toward the end of June, his sweetheart, Mabel Hubbard, was taking the train for the Centennial, and he went to the depot to say goodbye. Here Miss Hubbard learned for the first time that Bell was not to go. She coaxed and pleaded without effect. Then, as the train was starting, leaving Bell on the platform, the affectionate young girl could no longer control her feelings and was overcome by a passion of tears. At this, the susceptible Bell, like a true Sir Galahad, dashed after the moving train and sprang aboard, without ticket or baggage, oblivious of his classes and his poverty, and of all else except this one maiden's distress. "I never saw a man," said Watson, "so much in love as Bell was." As it happened, this impromptu trip to the Centennial proved to be one of the most timely acts of his life. On the following Sunday afternoon, the judges were to make a special tour of inspection, and Mr. Hubbard, after much trouble, had obtained a promise that they would spend a few minutes examining Bell's telephone. By this time, it had been on exhibition for more than 6 weeks without attracting the serious attention of anybody. When Sunday afternoon arrived, Bell was at his little table, nervous yet confident. But hour after hour went by, and the judges did not arrive. The day was intensely hot, and they had many wonders to examine. There was the first electric light, and the first grain binder, and the musical telegraph of Elisha Gray, and the marvelous exhibit of printing telegraphs shown by the Western Union Company. By the time they came to Bell's table through a litter of school desks and blackboards, the hour was 7 o'clock, and every man in the party was hot, tired, and hungry. Several announced their intention of returning to their hotels. One took up a telephone receiver, looked at it blankly, and put it down again. He did not even place it to his ear. Another judge made a slighting remark which raised a laugh at Bell's expense. Then, a most marvelous thing happened. Such an incident as would make a chapter in the Arabian Nights entertainments. Accompanied by his wife, the Empress Teresa, and a bevy of courtiers, the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro de Alcantara, walked into the room, advanced with both hands outstretched to the bewildered Bell, and exclaimed, "Professor Bell, I am delighted to see you again." The judges at once forgot the heat and the fatigue and the hunger. Who is this young inventor with the pale complexion and black eyes that he should be the friend of emperors? They did not know, and for the moment even Bell himself had forgotten that Dom Pedro had once visited Bell's class of deaf mutes at Boston University. He was especially interested in such humanitarian work, and had recently helped to organize the first Brazilian school for deaf mutes at Rio de Janeiro. And so, with the tall, blonde-bearded Dom Pedro in the center, the assembled judges and scientists, there were full 50 in all, entered with unusual zest into the proceedings of this first telephone exhibition. A wire had been strung from one end of the room to the other, and while Bell went to the transmitter, Dom Pedro took up the receiver and placed it to his ear. It was a moment of tense expectancy. No one knew clearly what was about to happen, when the emperor, with a dramatic gesture, raised his head from the receiver and exclaimed with a look of utter amazement, "My God, it talks!" Next came to the receiver the oldest scientist in the group, the venerable Joseph Henry, whose encouragement to Bell had been so timely. He stopped to listen, and, as one of the bystanders afterwards said, no one could forget the look of awe that came into his face as he heard that iron disc talking with a human voice. "This," said he, "comes nearer to overthrowing the doctrine of the conservation of energy than anything I ever saw." Then came Sir William Thomson, latterly known as Lord Kelvin. It was fitting that he should be there, for he was the foremost electrical scientist at that time in the world, and had been the engineer of the first Atlantic cable. He listened and learned what even he had not known before, that a solid metallic body could take up from the air all the countless varieties of vibrations produced by speech, and that these vibrations could be carried along a wire and reproduced exactly by a second metallic body. He nodded his head solemnly as he rose from the receiver. "It does speak," he said emphatically. "It is the most wonderful thing I have seen in America." So, one after another, this notable company of men listened to the voice of the first telephone, and the more they knew of science, the less they were inclined to believe their ears. The wiser they were, the more they wondered. To Henry and Thomson, the masters of electrical magic, this instrument was as surprising as it was to the man in the street, and both were noble enough to admit frankly their astonishment in the reports which they made as judges, when they gave Bell a certificate of award. "Mr. Bell has achieved a result of transcendent scientific interest," wrote Sir William Thomson. "I heard it speak distinctly several sentences. I was astonished and delighted. It was the greatest marvel hitherto achieved by the electric telegraph." Until nearly 10 o'clock that night, the judges talked and listened by turns at the telephone. Then, next morning, they brought the apparatus to the judge's pavilion, where for the remainder of the summer it was mobbed by judges and scientists. Sir William Thomson and his wife ran back and forth between the two ends of the wire like a pair of delighted children. And thus it happened that the crude little instrument that had been tossed into an out-of-the-way corner became the star of the centennial. It had been given no more than 18 words in the official catalog. And here it was, acclaimed as the wonder of wonders. It had been conceived in a cellar and born in a machine shop. And now, of all the gifts that our young American Republic had received on its 100th birthday, the telephone was honored as the rarest and most welcome of them all. And its future, circa 1910. In the spring of 1907, Theodore N. Vail, a rugged, ruddy, white-haired man, was superintending the building of a big barn in northern Vermont. His house stood nearby, on a balcony of rolling land that overlooked the town of Linden and far beyond, across evergreen forests to the massive bulk of Burke Mountain. His farm, very nearly 10 square miles in area, lay back of the house in a great oval of field and woodland with several dozen cottages in the clearings. His Welsh ponies and Swiss cattle were grazing on the May grass, and the men were busy with the plows and harrows and seeders. It was almost 30 years since he had been called in to create the business structure of telephony and to shape the general plan of its development. Since then he had done many other things. The one city of Buenos Aires had paid him more merely for giving it a system of trolleys and electric lights than the United States had paid him for putting the telephone on a business basis. He was now rich and retired, free to enjoy his play work of the farm and to forget the troubles of the city and the telephone. But as he stood among his barn builders, there arrived from Boston and New York a delegation of telephone directors. Most of them belonged to the old guard of telephony. They had fought under Vail in the pioneer days, and now they had come to ask him to return to the telephone business after 20 years of absence. Vail laughed at the suggestion. "Nonsense," he said. "I'm too old. I'm 62 years of age." The directors persisted. They spoke of the approaching storm cloud of panic and the need of another strong hand at the wheel until the crisis was over, but Vail still refused. They spoke of old times and old memories, but he shook his head. "All my life," he said, "I have wanted to be a farmer." Then they drew a picture of the telephone situation. They showed him that the grand telephonic system which he had planned was unfinished. He was its architect, and it was undone. The telephone business was energetic and prosperous. Under the brilliant leadership of Frederick B. Fish, it had grown by leaps and bounds, but it was still far from being the system that Vail had dreamed of in his younger days. And so, when the directors put before him his unfinished plan, he surrendered. The instinct for completeness, which is one of the dominating characteristics of his mind, compelled him to consent. It was the call of the telephone. Since that May morning, 1907, great things have been done by the men of the telephone and telegraph world. The Bell system was brought through the panic without a scratch. When the doubt and confusion were at their worst, Vail wrote an open letter to his stockholders in his practical, farmer-like way. He said, "Our net earnings for the last 10 months were $13,715,000, as against $11,579,000 for the same period in 1906. We have now in the banks over $18 million, and we will not need to borrow any money for 2 years." Soon afterwards, the work of consolidation began. Companies that overlapped were united. Small local wire clusters, several thousands of them, were linked to the national lines. A policy of publicity superseded the secrecy which had naturally grown to be a habit in the days of patent litigation. Visitors and reporters found an open door. Educational advertisements were published in the most popular magazines. The corps of inventors was spurred up to conquer the long-distance problems. And in return for a $30 million check, the control of the historic Western Union was transferred from the children of Jay Gould to the 30,000 stockholders of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. From what has been done, therefore, we may venture a guess as to the future of the telephone. This grand telephonic system, which had no existence 30 years ago except in the imagination of Vale, seems to be at hand. The very newsboys in the streets are crying it. And while there is, of course, no exact blueprint of a best possible telephone system, we can now see the general outlines of Vale's plan. There is nothing mysterious or ominous in this plan. It has nothing to do with the pools and conspiracies of Wall Street. No one will be squeezed out except the promoters of paper companies. The simple fact is that Vale is organizing a complete Bell system for the same reason that he built one big comfortable barn for his Swiss cattle and his Welsh ponies instead of half a dozen small uncomfortable sheds. He has never been a high financier to juggle profits out of other men's losses. He is merely applying to the telephone business the same hard sense that any farmer uses in the management of his farm. He is building a big barn, metaphorically, for the telephone and telegraph. Plainly, the telephone system of the future will be national, so that any two people in the same country will be able to talk to one another. It will not be competitive for the reason that no farmer would think for a moment of running his farm on competitive lines. It will have a staff and line organization, to use a military phrase. Each local company will continue to handle its own local affairs and exercise to the full the basic virtue of self-help. But there will also be, as now, a central body of experts to handle the larger affairs that are common to all companies. No separateness or secession on the one side, nor bureaucracy on the other. That is the typically American idea that underlines the ideal telephone system. The line of authority in such a system will begin with the local manager. From him, it will rise to the directors of the state company, then higher still to the directors of the national company, and finally, above all corporate leaders, to the federal government itself. The failure of government ownership of the telephone in so many foreign countries does not mean that the private companies will have absolute power. Quite the reverse. The lesson of 30 years' experience shows that a private telephone company is apt to be much more obedient to the will of the people than if it were a government department. But it is an axiom of democracy that no company, however well conducted, will be permitted to control a public convenience without being held strictly responsible for its own acts. As politics becomes less of a game and more of a responsibility, the telephone of the future will doubtless be supervised by some sort of public committee, which will have power to pass upon complaints and to prevent the nuisance of duplication and the swindle of watering stock. As this federal supervision becomes more and more efficient, the present fear of monopoly will decrease just as it did in the case of the railways. It is a fact, although now generally forgotten, that the first railways of the United States were run for 10 years or more on an anti-monopoly plan. The tracks were free to all. Anyone who owned a cart with flanged wheels could drive it on the rails and compete with the locomotives. There was a happy-go-lucky jumble of trains and wagons, all held back by the slowest team, and this continued on some railways until as late as 1857. By that time, the people saw that competition on a railway track was absurd. They allowed each track to be monopolized by one company, and the era of expansion began. No one, certainly at the present time, regrets the passing of the independent teamster. He was much more arbitrary and expensive than any railroad has ever dared to be, and as the country grew, he became impossible. He was not the fittest to survive. For the general good, he was held back from competing with the railroad and taught to cooperate with it by hauling freight to and from the depots. This, to his surprise, he found much more profitable and pleasant. He had been squeezed out of a bad job into a good one. And by a similar process of evolution, the United States is rapidly outgrowing the small independent telephone companies. These will eventually, one by one, rise as the teamster did to a higher social value by clasping wires with the main system of telephony. Until 1881, the Bell system was in the hands of a family group. It was a strictly private enterprise. The public had been asked to help in its launching and had refused. But after 1881, it passed into the control of the small stockholders and has remained there without a break. It is now one of our most democratized businesses, scattering either wages or dividends into more than 100,000 homes. It has at times been exclusive, but never sordid. It has never been dollar mad nor frenzied by the virus of stock gambling. There has always been a vein of sentiment in it that kept it in touch with human nature. Even at the present time, each check of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company carries on it a picture of a pretty Cupid sitting on a chair upon which he has placed a thick book and gaily prattling into a telephone. Several sweeping changes may be expected in the near future now that there is a team play between the Bell system and the Western Union. Already, by a stroke of the pen, 5 million users of telephones have been put on the credit books of the Western Union, and every Bell telephone office is now a telegraph office. 3 telephone messages and 8 telegrams may be sent at the same time over 2 pairs of wires. 3 telegraph messages and 8 telegrams may be sent at the same time over 2 pairs of wires. That is one of the recent miracles of science and is now to be tried out upon a gigantic scale. Most of the long-distance telephone wires, fully 2 million miles, can be used for telegraphic purposes, and a third of the Western Union wires, 500,000 miles, may with a few changes be used for talking. The Western Union is paying rent for 22,500 offices, all of which helps to make telegraphy a luxury of the few. It is employing as large a force of messenger boys as the army that marched with General Sherman from Atlanta to the sea. Both of these items of expense will dwindle when a Bell wire and a Morse wire can be brought to a common terminal, and when a telegram can be received or delivered by telephone. There will also be a gain, perhaps the largest of all, in removing the trudging little messenger boy from the streets and sending him either to school or to learn some useful trade. The fact is that the United States is the first country that has succeeded in putting both telephone and telegraph upon the proper basis. Elsewhere, either the two are widely apart or the telephone is a mere adjunct of a telegraphic department. According to the new American plan, the two are not competitive, but complementary. The one is a supplement to the other. The post office sends a package, the telegraph sends the contents of the package, but the telephone sends nothing. It is an apparatus that makes conversation possible between two separated people. Each of the three has a distinct field of its own, so that there has never been any cause for jealousy among them. To make the telephone an annex of the post office or the telegraph has become absurd. There are now in the whole world very nearly as many messages sent by telephone as by letter, and there are 32 times as many telephone calls as telegrams. In the United States, the telephone has grown to be the big brother of the telegraph. It has 6 times the net earnings and 8 times the wire. And it transmits as many messages as the combined total of telegrams, letters, and railroad passengers. This universal trend towards consolidation has introduced a variety of problems that will engage the ablest brains in the telephone world for many years to come. How to get the benefits of organization without its losses, to become strong without losing quickness, to become systematic without losing the dash and dare of earlier days, to develop the working force into an army of high-speed specialists without losing the bird's-eye view of the whole situation. These are the riddles of the new type for which the telephonists of the next generation must find the answers. They illustrate the nature of the big jobs that the telephone has to offer to an ambitious and gifted young man of today. The problems never were as large or as complex as they are right now, says J.J. Carty, the chief of the telephone engineers. The eternal struggle remains between the large and little ideas, between the men who see what might be and the men who only see what is. There is still the race to break records. Already, the girl at the switchboard can find the person wanted in 30 seconds. This is 1/10 of the time that was taken in the early centrals, but it is still too long. It is 1/2 of a valuable minute. It must be cut to 25 seconds or 20 or 15. There is still the inventor's battle to gain miles. The distance over which conversations can be held has been increased from 20 miles to 2,500, but this is not far enough. There are some civilized human beings who are 12,000 miles apart and who have interests in common. During the Boxer Rebellion in China, for instance, there were Americans in Peking who would gladly have given half of their fortunes for the use of a pair of wires to New York. In the earliest days of the telephone, Bell was fond of prophesizing that The time will come when we will talk across the Atlantic Ocean. But this was regarded as poetical fancy until Pupin invented his method of automatically propelling the electric current. Since then, the most conservative engineer will discuss the problem of transatlantic telephony. And as for the poets, they are now dreaming of the time when a man may speak and hear his own voice come back to him around the world. The immediate long-distance problem is, of course, to talk from New York to the Pacific. The two oceans are now only 3.5 days apart by rail. Seattle is clamoring for a wire to the east. San Diego wants one in time for her Panama Canal Exposition in 1915. The wires are already strung to San Francisco, but cannot be used in the present stage of the art. And Vail's captains are working now with almost breathless haste to give him a birthday present of a talk across the continent from his farm in Vermont. "I can see a universal system of telephony for the United States in the very near future," says Carty. "There's a statue of Seward standing in one of the streets of Seattle. The inscription upon it is, 'To a United Country.' But as an Easterner stands there, he feels the isolation of that far western state, and he will always feel it until he can talk from one side of the United States to the other. For my part," continues Carty, "I believe we will talk across continents and across oceans. Why not? Are there not more cells in one human body than there are people in the whole earth?" Some future, Carty may solve the abandoned problem of the single wire and cut the copper bill in two by restoring the grounded circuit. He may transmit vision as well as speech. He may perfect a third rail system for use on moving trains. He may conceive of an ideal insulating material to supersede glass, mica, paper, and enamel. He may establish a universal code so that all persons of importance in the United States shall have call numbers by which they may instantly be located, as books are in a library. Some other young man may create a commercial department on wide lines, a work which telephone men have as yet been too specialized to do. Whoever does this will be a man of comprehensive brain. He will be as closely in touch with the average man as with the art of telephony. He will know the gossip of the streets, the demands of the labor unions, and the policies of governors and presidents. The psychology of the Western farmer will concern him, and the tone of the daily press and the methods of department stores. It will be his aim to know the subtle chemistry of public opinion, and to adapt the telephone service to the shifting moods and necessities of the time. He will fit telephony like a garment around the habits of the people. Also, now that the telephone business has become strong, its next anxiety must be to develop the virtues and not the defects of strength. Its motto must be Ich dien, I serve. And it will be the work of the future statesmen of the telephone to illustrate this motto in all its practical variations. They will cater and explain and explain and cater. They will educate and educate until they have created an expert public. They will teach by pictures and lectures and exhibitions. They will have charts and diagrams hung in the telephone booths so that the person who is waiting for a call may learn a little and pass the time more pleasantly. They will, in a word, attend to those innumerable trifles that make the perfection of public service. Already the Bell system has gone far in this direction by organizing what might fairly be called a foresight department. Here is where the fortune tellers of the business sit. When new lines or exchanges are to be built, these men study the situation with an eye to the future. They prepare a fundamental plan, outlining what may reasonably be expected to happen in 15 or 20 years. Invariably, they are optimists. They make provision for growth, but none at all for shrinkage. By their advice, there is now $25 million worth of reserve plant in the various Bell companies, waiting for the country to grow up to it. Even in the city of New York, 1/2 of the cable ducts are empty, in expectation of the greater city of 8 million population, which is scheduled to arrive in 1928. There are perhaps few more impressive evidences of practical optimism and confidence than a new telephone exchange, with 2/3 of its wires waiting for the business of the future. Eventually, this foresight department will expand. It may, if a leader of genius appears, become the first real corps of practical sociologists, which will substitute facts for the present hodgepodge of theories. It will prepare a fundamental plan of the whole United States, showing the center of each industry and the main runways of traffic. It will act upon the basic fact that wherever there is interdependence, there is bound to be telephony. And it will therefore prepare maps of interdependence, showing the widely scattered groups of industry and finance and the lines that weave them into a pattern of national cooperation. As yet, no nation, not even our own, has seen the full value of the long-distance telephone. Few have the imagination to see what has been made possible and to realize that an actual face-to-face conversation may take place even though there may be 1,000 miles between. Neither can it seem credible that a man in a distant city may be located as readily as though he were close at hand. It is too amazing to be true, and possibly a new generation will have to arrive before it will be taken for granted and acted upon freely. Ultimately, there can be no doubt that long-distance telephony will be regarded as a national asset of the highest value, for the reason that it can prevent so much of the enormous economic waste of travel. Nothing that science can say will ever decrease the marvel of a long-distance conversation, and there may come in the future an interpreter who will put it before our eyes in the form of a moving picture. He will enable us to follow the flying words in a talk from Boston to Denver. We will flash first to Worcester, across the Hudson on the High Bridge at Poughkeepsie, swing southwest through a dozen coal towns to the outskirts of Philadelphia, leap across the Susquehanna, zigzag up and down the Alleghenies into the murk of Pittsburgh, across the Ohio at Wheeling, glance past Columbus and Indianapolis, over the Wabash at Terre Haute, into the St. Louis by the Eads Bridge, through Kansas City, across the Missouri, along the cornfields of Kansas, and then on with the Santa Fe Railway across vast plains and past the brink of the Grand Canyon to Pueblo and the lofty city of Denver. 2,500 miles along 1,000 tons of copper wire, from Bunker Hill to Pikes Peak in a second. Hubert Spencer, in his autobiography, alludes to the impressive fact that while the eye is reading a single line of type, the Earth has traveled 30 miles through space. But this, in telephony, would be slow traveling. It is simple everyday truth to say that while your eye is reading this dash, a telephone sound can be carried from New York to Chicago. There are many reasons to believe that for the practical idealists of the future, the supreme study will be the force that makes such miracles possible. $60,000 million, 1/20th of our national wealth, is at the present time invested in electrical development. The electrical age has not yet arrived, but it is at hand, and no one can tell how brilliant the result may be when the creative minds of a nation are focused upon the subdual of this mysterious force, which has more power and more delicacy than any other force that man has been able to harness. As a tame and tractable energy, electricity is new. It has no past and no pedigree. It is younger than many people who are now alive. Among the wise men of Greece and Rome, few knew its existence and none put it to any practical use. The wisest knew that a piece of amber, when rubbed, will attract feathery substances. But they regarded this as poetry rather than science. There was a pretty legend among the Phoenicians that the pieces of amber were the petrified tears of maidens who had thrown themselves into the sea because of unrequited love, and each bead of amber was highly prized. It was worn as an amulet and a symbol of purity. Not for 2,000 years did anyone dream that within its golden heart lay hidden the secret of a new electrical civilization. Not even in 1752, when Benjamin Franklin flew his famous kite on the banks of the Schuylkill River and captured the first canned lightning, was there any definite knowledge of electrical energy. His lightning rod was regarded as an insult to the deity of heaven. It was blamed for the earthquake of 1755, and not until the telegraph of Morse came into general use did men dare to think of the thunderbolt of Jove as a possible servant of the human race. Thus it happened that when Bell invented the telephone, he surprised the world with a new idea. He had to make the thoughts as well as the thing. No Jules Verne or H.G. Wells had foreseen it. The author of the Arabian Nights fantasies had conceived of a flying carpet, but neither he nor anyone else had conceived of flying conversation. In all the literature of ancient days, there is not a line that will apply to the telephone, except possibly that expressive phrase in the Bible, "And there came a voice." In these more privileged days, the telephone has come to be regarded as a commonplace fact of everyday life, and we are apt to forget that the wonder of it has become greater and not less. and that there are still honor and profit, plenty of both, to be won by the inventor and the scientist. The flood of electrical patents was never higher than now. There are literally more in a single month than the total number issued by the Patent Office up to 1859. The Bell system has 300 experts who are paid to do nothing else but try out all new ideas and inventions, and before these words can pass into the printed book, new uses and new methods will have been discovered. There is therefore no immediate danger that the art of telephony will be less fascinating in the future than it has been in the past. It will still be the most alluring and elusive sprite that ever led the way through a dark continent of mysterious phenomena. There still remains for some future scientists the task of showing us in detail exactly what the telephone current does. Such a man will study vibrations as Darwin studied the differentiation of species. He will investigate how a child's voice speaking from Boston to Omaha can vibrate more than 1,000,000 pounds of copper wire. And he will invent a finer system of time to fit the telephone. He will investigate how a child's voice speaking from Boston to Omaha can vibrate more than 1,000,000 pounds of copper wire. And he will invent a finer system of time to fit the telephone, which can do as many different things in a second as a man can do in a day, transmitting with every tick of the clock from 25 to 80,000 vibrations. He will deal with the various vibrations of nerves and wires and wireless air that are necessary in conveying thought between two separated minds. He will make clear how a thought originating in the brain passes along the nerve wires to the vocal cords, and then in wireless vibration of air to the disc of the transmitter. At the other end of the line, the second disc recreates these vibrations, which impinge upon the nerve wires of an ear, and are thus carried to the consciousness of another brain. And so, notwithstanding all that has been done since Bell opened up the way, the telephone remains the acme of electrical marvels. No other thing does so much with so little energy. No other thing is more enswathed in the unknown. Not even the gray-haired pioneers who have lived with the telephone since its birth can understand their protege. As to the why and the how, there is as yet no answer. It is a true of telephony today as it was in 1876, that a child can use what the wisest sages cannot comprehend. Here is a tiny disc of sheet iron. I speak, it shudders. It has a different shudder for every sound. It has thousands of millions of different shudders. There is a second disc, many miles away, perhaps 2,500 miles away. Between the two discs runs a copper wire. As I speak, a thrill of electricity flits along the wire. This thrill is molded by the shudder of the disc. It makes the second disc shudder, and the shudder of the second disc reproduces my voice. That is what happens. But how? Not all the scientists of the world can tell. The telephone current is a phenomenon of the ether, say the theorists. But what is ether? No one knows. Sir Oliver Lodge has guessed that it is perhaps the most substantial thing in the material universe, but no one knows. There is nothing to guide us in that unknown country except a signpost that points upwards and bears the one word, perhaps. The ether of space. Here's an El Dorado for the scientists of the future, and whoever can first map it out will go far towards discovering the secret of telephony. Someday, who knows, there may come the poetry and grand opera of the telephone. Artists may come who will portray the marvel of the wires that quiver with electrified words, and the romance of the switchboards that tremble with the secrets of a great city. Already, Puvis de Chavannes, by one of his superb panels in the Boston Library, has admitted the telephone and the telegraph to the world of art. He has embodied them as two flying figures poised above the electric wires, and with the following inscription underneath: "By the wondrous agency of electricity, speech dashes through space, and swift as lightning bears tidings of good and evil." But these random guesses as to the future of the telephone may fall far short of what the reality will be. In these dazzling days, it is idle to predict. The inventor has everywhere put the prophet out of business. Fact has outrun fancy. When Morse, for instance, was tacking up his first little line of wire around the Speedwell Ironworks, who could have foreseen 250,000 miles of submarine cables, by which the very oceans are all aquiver with the news of the world. When Fulton's tiny tea kettle of a boat steamed up the Hudson to Albany in 2 days, who could have foreseen the steel leviathans, 1/6 of a mile in length, that can in the same time cut the Atlantic Ocean in halves? And when Bell stood in a dingy workshop in Boston and heard the clang of a clock spring come over an electric wire, who could have foreseen the massive structure of the Bell system, built up by half the telephones of the world and by the investment of more actual capital than has gone to the making of any other industrial association? Who could have foreseen what the telephone bells have done to ring out the old ways and to ring in the new, to ring out delay and isolation, and to ring in the efficiency and the friendliness of a truly united people? This has been Mr. Watson, Come Here, The Birth of the Telephone and Its Future, circa 1910. Written by Herbert N. Casson. Narrated by Brian Daniels. Copyright 2020 by MSAC Philosophy Group. Production copyright by David Christopher Lane.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.